Okay, Boirun, bienvenidos a todos. Welcome everybody to the first in our wonderful three-part series on Sephardic Judaism in Republican Turkey. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for La Hermandad Sephardi de America, the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America. We're proud to bring you this program through our new Sephardic Digital Academy. It's a brand new initiative that we launched a few months ago to help connect all Sephardic communities across the United States and really around the world through classes on Sephardic Torah, Halakha, cooking, Ladino language and culture, and obviously history and so much more, all about our Ladino, Ottoman, and Turkish and Greek Sephardic history. We're so excited here tonight to have our dear friend Nesi Altaras, a new friend of mine, and actually a new friend of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood, a recent new member of the Brotherhood, and we're so happy to have him with us tonight. Nesi will be presenting tonight on Sephardic Judaism in Republican Turkey, and just give you a little background about him. So Nesi Altaras is a master's student in political science at McGill University from Istanbul, Turkey. A member of the Jewish community of Turkey, Nesi is a writer and editor of the online Jewish publication Avlaremos, and his current research is on the migration of the Jews from Kurdistan in the final years of the Ottoman Empire. His previous work was on the failed peace and reconciliation process in Turkey on the Kurdish question. His interest is in minorities in both contemporary Middle East and in the late Ottoman history, as well as identity politics in Turkey. Nesi, it's so great to have you with us tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be doing this today. Sorry, it's a little later here than it is over there, but I'll jump right in and start with the presentation. And I think you should all be able to see that right now. Is that good, Ethan?
Well, yeah. Good.
Sounds good. Great. So we're going to start with the Republic in 1923, just so that it's a clear-cut timeline. And before we get into the details, I want to start off by thanking Ethan for hosting this and giving me the platform to introduce what's been going on in our community, in our lives. Basically, since a lot of Sephardic people have left Turkey and what was in the Ottoman Empire to move to the US and Mexico and Cuba, and what happened to those who stayed. So this will be their story. And I want to thank my friend Serdar Korucu from Avlaremos for helping me with the structure of today and the next 2 weeks. So this is the plan. And today we're going to focus on the one-party republic. And unfortunately, it's maybe the one that's filled with the most events. So it's going to be quite a squeeze. So there'll be a lot of stories that I won't have time for, but if you have any questions, please ask them. And I would like to start with a few caveats. So our plan is to talk about the Sephardic Jews of the Turkish Republic. But it's important to note that there are other Jews who basically assimilated into the Sephardic majority community. So these are Ashkenazim, Kurdistanis, Arabic speakers, Kurdish speakers, Aramaic speakers, and we can get to these in questions if we have time. So we're gonna start with who we're talking about, basically. So who are the Jews of the Republic? When the Republic is set in 1923, we're basically seeing two major population centers and smaller communities throughout. So the first population center that we want to talk about is Izmir, which is this coastal area, and its hinterland, the Aegean region of Turkey. So Jews have lived in this area for many centuries, and thousands of them live in this major city of Izmir, and the towns around it, from Milas and Bodrum to Tire and all these other places. And the second population center is the Thrace region, which is this part of the 4 provinces of Edirne, Kırklareli, Tekirdağ, Çanakkale, which extends over to the other side, and Istanbul, the European half you can see here. So these provinces constitute the main centers of the population we talk about. There's also Jews in Ankara, Jews in Adana, who are also Ladino-speaking Sephardim, but the main population is centered in these towns and cities. So at the time, when my grandfather's Nesim's family lived in Tekirdağ's Jewish neighborhood, and my other grandparents lived in Istanbul's Balat neighborhood, our community spoke almost entirely Ladino at home and in public. And there was a strong majority of women who are monolingual, so the language use is quite gendered. And the Jewish communities were large enough to host public celebrations of Purim, for example, in Izmir and in Istanbul, and they didn't really fear this public visibility. But when we come to the Republican period after World War I and the Independence War, especially the Jews of Izmir are in a tougher spot because they're facing this issue of refugees. This area inland basically has been wrecked by the war between Greece and Turkey. And there's thousands of Jewish refugees who have flocked to the Izmir community and need their help. Istanbul, though it was also occupied during the war, is facing less of that problem. But the Jewish community we're talking about at this time is somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people, which is quite large, though not in comparison to Ottoman Jewry, which included the Balkans and importantly Salonika. And of that number, around 90,000 are living in Istanbul. So the Jews make up almost 1% of Turkey, which looking back from today was a huge number. And it's important to note that this population is almost entirely made up of the urban poor. So in Istanbul, the Jews are living in the Galata neighborhood around the Lakula, the Galata Tower, and in Balat, and in these traditional houses named Yahudhane, which means a Jew home. These are Ottoman style, so to speak, and they have these wooden bay windows. And this is the type of place that Jews occupied in the Turkish landscape, not only in Istanbul, but also in Izmir and also in Tekirdağ, also in Edirne and so on. An example of their class condition, I think, comes from Eli Scholl's memoirs. He describes this man in his neighborhood in Balat in the 1920s named Avram in the cottage, and he lived with his bachelor sister and his older mother, and he would peddle oranges that were so rotten that they would smell up the street. But Eli Scholl notes that this rotten orange peddler had so many customers because the Jews of this neighborhood could only afford those oranges. So that's the material condition of the population we're talking about. And we're also reminded of this population as a population of trauma. Their mentality is severely affected by the fate of the Christians up until that point. They're witnessing the genocide of the Armenians, they're hearing news of the Pontic Greeks, and they're witnessing in 1924 the expulsion of the Orthodox Christians. All of the Greeks that live outside of Istanbul are being expelled. So these traumas make Jews feel unsafe in that they're thinking constantly that they're next in line, that they are the third other who will feel the wrath of this new happening, basically. And they're much more insular than the Greeks and the Armenians, who are also much larger. So this idea of we're next is always in the back of the elites and regular Jews who are making calculations and plans for their future. So we can start talking about the more specific events of the century by underlining first, what is the situation of Turkey? What is this country that is forming and who is it for? Is it for these Jewish shoemakers in Balat and these refugee Jewish kids in Izmir, or is it for someone else? And in that question, we have a quite direct answer from the founder of the country. So Ataturk is the first president and founder of Turkey, and he describes what this country is quite clearly. So he says, the nation that we are here to preserve and defend is, of course, not only comprised of one element, it is composed of various elements, various Muslim elements. We have repeated and confirmed and altogether accepted with sincerity that each and every element that has created this collective are citizens who respect each other and each other's racial, social, geographic rights. Therefore, we share the same interests. The unity that we seek to achieve is not only of Turks or of Cherkess, but of all Muslim elements that include all of these. So, right off the bat, he's clear that this country is one of diversity. But those diversity is circumscribed to Muslims. So to be a member of this political community and to be a full citizen, a first grade citizen of this country, being a Muslim is an expectation. So Jews find themselves in a country where they're not the primary citizens. And when Atatürk gave this quote to the Grand National Assembly, it was not out of the ordinary. So we can talk about this idea that a lot of scholars of Turkey talk about is a contract of Muslimness. Basically, the country is founded on this contract that all Muslims will have first grade citizenship. Though this over time turns into, before the 30s, turns into a contract of Turkishness that emphasizes Sunni Muslimness as well as speaking Turkish at home. So clearly, Jews cannot fulfill one of them without assimilating, which is the Sunni part. But elites and later lay people jump on this opportunity to at least approach first grade citizenship by assimilating linguistically. By taking on Turkish language into their homes, they're trying to become first-rate citizens to take advantage of the benefits. And this also comes with this idea of the 88th article of the Constitution, which says, quote, "The people of Turkey, regardless of their religion and race, are Turkish in terms of citizenship." So this idea that every single person in Turkey is Turkish is kind of problematic for Jews, but they try to sidestep it by creating a new concept. So up until this time, Jews in Turkish are referred to as Yahudi, which is, like most languages, derived from the same root, Jew, Juden, Judio, all the similar root. But at this time, there's a new word that comes about called Musevi, which is the followers of Moses. So basically, the attempt is to differentiate between the peoplehood, Jews as a people, and their faith. And then this idea that Jews are simply Turks of Jewish faith becomes popular, and they try to underline this as much as possible and differentiate themselves from the more undesirable and the disliked Christian populations. They don't want to be, oh, like those other people, Jews, Greeks, and Armenians. They don't want to be part of the triple collective, and instead side themselves with the Muslim majority, often in contradistinction to the Christians. But the state isn't really on their side in this effort. What the state is actually looking for is a Turkification of the entire country, and Jews don't really mix well with the effort because they are automatically becoming an obstacle to the Sunni majority that can also give legitimacy to the state. And we see this most clearly in the competing conceptions of Jews as citizens who have rights and Jews as non-Muslims who face restrictions. So the country is founded when the Western powers recognize it in the Republic of Lausanne, in the Treaty of Lausanne, in 1923, where the Turkish delegation actually included the chief rabbi at the time, Haim Nahum, and the articles 37 through 45 deal with minorities. They give the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, and the Jews, the three official minority communities, and no one else, the rights to use their language, the rights to use their own practices in family law, such as inheritance and marriage and divorce, and they give them the right to teach their national language in their own schools. And this idea of a national language of Jews is going to become problematic, and we'll get to this later. So here we see this idea that Jews have rights, not only as citizens of Turkey, but also because they're minorities, they're getting some additional rights as communities that can become self-governing and have their own rules in terms of family law. But on the flip side, we see a lot of restrictions. For example, we see a mass disbarring of non-Muslim lawyers for unethical conduct. And this affects more Greeks and Armenians, and this is true for a lot of the restrictions we're going to talk about, though it is quite an issue for Jews as well. We see this in the issue of public sector jobs, and this is a continuous problem. Every public sector non-Muslim is fired when the republic is consolidated, and no new ones are hired. So there's no civil servants who are non-Muslim, including Jews, and there's also no Jews who work for publicly owned companies, which are quite numerous at the time. For example, the electricity company of Istanbul at the time was a Belgian company that was then taken into public ownership. And as soon as that happened, every non-Muslim employee was fired. We also see this in the military. So as citizens with equal rights, Jews are required to serve in the military, which makes sense. But then as non-Muslims, they're not allowed to serve with guns. They're not allowed to practice supposedly military training with the proper equipment that the Muslims are receiving. They're also not allowed to enroll in officer colleges, so the Army College or the Navy College. And they're also not allowed to travel freely. If a Jew wants to travel from Istanbul to Tekirdağ, they have to get an approval from the local police, and they can be denied that approval for interprovincial travel. There's also further restrictions on residence, which again are more stringent for Greeks and Armenians. But for example, the most specific example is a ban on Jews residing in the province of Aydın, which is right next to Izmir and which had a Jewish community up until then, especially up until the Independence War, but it was destroyed in the process, and the government did not want people to resettle in that town. The government expressly is trying to push all non-Muslims towards Istanbul, and from there out of the country. And we also see after this treaty a major pressure from the government on these quite small communities, especially for the Armenians and Greeks who are losing massive numbers of population and who have just survived genocide, and Jews who have always been the smallest community, are under massive pressure from the government to relinquish these rights that the Treaty of Lausanne guarantees them. And as you can imagine, the people with the idea that we're next are not too keen on turning down the government that says, do this. So they give up these rights quite fast, publicly renouncing their right to separate family law and the right to language, which we're going to return to. So the question of language is on the mind of Turkish leaders throughout this time. Ataturk talks about a nation as a place where people, as a group that speaks the same language, and that speaking Turkish, as you can see in this quote, is the main thing that makes someone Turkish. And as the constitution says, every citizen is a Turk, and thus they must speak Turkish. And İnönü, the prime minister in the 1935 and later president, agrees, we will not remain silent. All citizens who live with us must speak Turkish. So this us is doing a lot of the work in that sentence. It is highlighting the idea that we, the people who own the country, are the Muslim Turks, and everyone else who is living with us, the owners, have to assimilate to our language. And we see this with this language politics become problematic right off the bat. The first example of a story is from July 1925, when two people speaking Ladino in Bursa, a city near Istanbul, were fined by the municipal government because the municipal government of Bursa in 1925 decided to release an ordinance that declared all residents required to speak Turkish. So there was no space allowed in public, at least at this time, for speech in any other language. In fact, the government actually tried to make a national law of this sort in 1924, but it didn't pass the parliament. And this would have made every single non-Turkish speech act punishable by a fine. But instead of a national ban, These laws were made first in Bursa, later in Edirne, later in Adana, later in Tekirdağ, and later in Kırklareli throughout the 20s and 30s. These are all provinces with major Jewish populations, some with Armenian Greek populations, and basically the point is to push out non-Turkish languages from the public sphere. The national aspect of this, more than the fines, was the Citizens Speak Turkish campaign, which began in 1928. And it created laws similar to these provincial bans, and also produced columns and posters that supported the speech in Turkish of all peoples, regardless of their ethnicity. And it also created this social culture where Turkish speakers were feeling empowered to impose their culture on everyone else, such that two people speaking Ladino on a ferry going to the island could be reprimanded by a random person for speaking their own language. And this is quite a common occurrence if you look at memoirs from the time, that people were afraid to speak their language because they thought they would be told off, which they often did. And the question of language is also pervading the supposed right of Jews guaranteed by the Treaty of Lausanne, which is to their own schooling system. So there's a long history of Jewish schooling up until this time in the Ottoman Empire. And basically, there was quite an elaborate system with many schools. Here we see the teachers of Bnei Brit in Istanbul in 1937. And the first thing the government tries to do is make sure that every student attending a Jewish school learns Turkish, because that was not guaranteed before. A lot of the Jewish schools were in French, and sometimes some subjects were taught in Ladino, and Turkish was maybe the third language, if not non-existent. So the government first tried to introduce 5 hours of Turkish language teaching into the schools. But they also wanted to appoint their own teachers to do this teaching. And they also wanted to set the pay for those state-appointed Turkish teachers, which the privately funded Jewish schools would have to match. So this ended up being a situation where the privately funded Jewish schools were paying the state-appointed Turkish teachers 3 times what they paid their own teachers, who were mostly Jewish. This put a major financial strain on one of the integral parts of the communal structure. The next major thing the state did was firing every foreign citizen who taught in these schools. And this included a lot of the administrators and the teaching staff, particularly in the Alliance affiliated French schools. So that cleared out a lot of the Jewish staff from the schools as well, and most of them were replaced with Turkish people. Then there was a law that banned Jews from teaching history, geography, and national studies. So government-appointed teachers were then also introduced with the same pay problem. And the acting chief rabbi at the time, Rabbi Bejarano, really tried to get these reversed. He met with the governor of Istanbul, wrote him a letter, and then tried to also publicize this letter, but it was all to no avail. The attack on the independence of Jewish schools kept continuing, and the most clear example is with a test on Turkish literature. So every person who worked at any level, secretaries to principals to teachers, had to take a test in Turkish literature to keep their jobs in 1925. And unsurprisingly, almost all of the administrators of Jewish schools failed. For example, the principal, who had been in charge of the school in Ortaköy for many years, was summarily fired from his job, because these people were not schooled in any way in Turkish literature. Even if they spoke Turkish fluently, their expertise was in no way related to the subject. And then all the administrators were replaced by state appointees as well. So, but then Avner Levi, a scholar of early Jewish history in Turkey, summarizes the change in schooling by saying that everything worked out the way Jewish authorities wanted. Nothing related to Jewishness was taught. The education was decided, given, and administered by Turks to Jewish children. So the only thing that is Jewish about the schools by the end of the 20s is that the kids are Jewish. And another issue throughout this time is the issue of language. So we know the Lausanne gave Jews the right to teach in their national language. So the Turkish government was quite clever and decided that the national language of Jews must be Hebrew. So if the Jews were to choose to do so, they were allowed to teach entirely in Hebrew. But in 1924, barely any lay people spoke the language, and it was clearly impossible for the Jewish schools to convert to a Hebrew-based instruction at that time. The government knew this, and that's why they proposed this idea. So then the government said, well, if you can't do your national language, the only other acceptable option is Turkish. So instruction in Jewish schools very quickly turned into Turkish instruction. There's also a lot of talk in the press about anti-Semitism that uses this idea that Jews were being ungrateful to Turks by speaking the language of their former oppressors, Spanish, so that instead of Turkish. Not only are they not speaking their national language, Hebrew, and rejecting Turkish, they're insulting Turks by speaking their former oppressors' language. And this hounding of the press is perhaps most clearly illustrated by the really tragic case of Elsa Niego. In 1927, Elsa Niego was a 17-year-old Jewish woman, and she had faced issues with a 45-year-old civil servant who was Turkish named Osman Ragıp. He was a family man who had just had a grandson, and he was enamored with her by seeing her around Galata and kept hounding her, and she repeatedly rejected his advances, and she even complained about him to the police. And later on, she got engaged to a Jewish man, and hearing about this, Osman Ragıp was outraged, saw her on the street in Galata, and on 17th of August, Osman stabbed her to death. He was arrested and put on trial like any normal murder. And Elsa's funeral, which you can see here, was attended by many Jews in Galata. The entire community was extremely sad about the loss of this young woman, and it was a very bleak affair. But the next day, the Turkish newspapers started saying outrageous claims that were clearly false. They started saying that the funeral had turned into a public disturbance, that the Jews had swore at Turkishness, that they were clashing with the police, that were causing disorder. And of course, none of this was true, and none of this was backed up by any photo evidence or any real thing. I mean, we were talking about the people who are constantly thinking about where next. They are so far from clashing with the police and swearing at Turkishness in the streets of Galata. One of the columns mentioned that they chanted, "Down with the Turks, we want justice," which seems unthinkable. But summarily, 9 community leaders, including the secretary of the Galata community, Haim Levi, were brought to court on charges of rioting, disrupting police, and incitement against a section of the public. They were accused of leading anti-Turkish chants, beating up a Turkish man, and tried for months. And they spent most of those months in pre-trial detention. This just goes to show the amount of public hatred that had begun in the Republican period in Turkey. This was quite unusual for the Ottoman period, but basically as the country modernized, one of the modern things being imported was the anti-Semitism that was in vogue in Europe. One of the other sad parts of the Elsa Niego affair is that Jacques Pardo, who was a respected member of the community and a former teacher at the officer college who taught the then Prime Minister İsmet İnönü, sent a letter to the Prime Minister, his former students, saying the people on trial did nothing wrong and there was a miscommunication and they should be let go. Instead of being listened to, he was also arrested and charged with attempting to humiliate the judicial system. And throughout these trials that happened throughout 1927, the fact that these Jews spoke Ladino more than Turkish was marshaled as evidence that, of course, they would insult Turkishness. They kept insulting Turkishness by not speaking Turkish anyway. And the public ire that followed the trials led to the banning of Ladino signage, which was then in Hebrew script. And such signs were removed from the Balat Jewish Hospital, from the chief rabbinate building in Galata, as well as several businesses. But from this high point of public anti-Semitism, we go into a sort of lull that lasted until 1933. And then we get to one of the more famous events of this period of anti-Semitism. This picture is of the Tekirdağ Jewish community before the pogrom, and here is my great-grandfather, Solomon. As I said before, the government was trying to move the Jews out of their towns and towards Istanbul. And one of the acute areas of this was Thrace. So this region that has all Edirne, which is the main population center for Jews in this area, is on the border of Greece and Bulgaria. And the government is quite afraid that in the next war, this border will become important and our families, the Jewish communities in these areas, will be potential traitors and spies. So they think it would be best to move these people out of this area preemptively. So first in 1924, in June, they passed a settlement law, and it sought to limit the settlement of non-Turks in critical regions. In introducing it, the prime minister says, quote, "We want to be a Muslim country that speaks in one language, thinks the same, and has the same feelings," end quote. So that is the purpose of the settlement law, to go after this goal. In the 11th article of the law, it says, quote, "Those who do not speak Turkish as their mother tongue are forbidden from resettling in mass in towns and neighborhoods. So they'll be removed from Thrace and they cannot go back. And they're also banned from teaching a craft to their kin or creating workers or artisans groups." So not only are they being forced out of their homes, but they're also being forced out of their businesses, and they're being forced out of organizing in any way. But this law is basically creating the groundwork that is also being made by things like this. Here we see a Turkish fascist magazine. This is printed by this notorious Turkish fascist Cevat Rıfat, who throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s is going to continue hounding Jews in the press. So much so that at one point the government actually bans him from printing. And you can see that he is straight up copying the cover of Nazi magazines at the time, directly using the same images, translating the bottom, and importing this Nazi anti-Semitism into Turkey. And him, as well as another notorious fascist, Nihal Atsız, are moving into this area at the time, moving into Thrace, giving speaking tours, teaching at public high schools, basically trying to shape the consciousness of this area that has a lot of Jews to say, these people are against you, these people are bad, they should leave, you should not trust them. And the law that happened in 1934 and this environment come together in July 1934, basically as an attack. Some people don't choose to use the word pogrom, but I think it's appropriate. So in the first 2 weeks of July 1924, we see in Çanakkale, Edirne, Gelibolu, Tekirdağ, Kırklareli, Uzunköprü, and other towns, Muslim mobs forming to tear apart Jewish homes and businesses, looting and vandalizing. There are more than a few murders and various cases of rape. And the event then becomes known as La Furtuna in Ladino, which means the storm. And I'll just tell you one story of many, and it comes from Kırklareli, which perhaps had the worst violence. So after attacking 65 homes, the mob arrives at the home of Rabbi Moshe Fins, and they strip him naked and they shave his beard, and they steal all of his possessions from his home. And some sources say they also rape his wife and daughter. And by dawn, 400 Jews from this town alone were trying to get on trains at the train station. And the train station has more trains than usual. Usually there's maybe one or two train cars going to Istanbul at any time, but today there's numerous. And this is because the government had planned for this to happen. Throughout the region, no police intervened, but instead the police were guiding people onto trains at the train stations because that was what they're planned to be doing at this time. So as Jews left their homes in haste, escaping from violence, the trains kept coming to take them to Istanbul, where they arrived penniless and traumatized. And it's estimated that of the 13,000 Jews in Thrace at the time, only 3,000 were left. So in a matter of days, 10,000 people are moving out of numerous towns that they had lived in for hundreds of years and moving into Istanbul with like a suitcase and the clothes on their backs, basically, with as much as they can carry. In some towns, there's more time. In some towns, people don't leave overnight. They stay the next day, try to sell off as much as possible, and then leave. In other towns like Kırklareli, people just rush to the train station in the middle of the night. And this is one of the first distinct major anti-Semitic episodes in Turkish history. And throughout the 1930s and 40s, we see the shadow of Nazism take over Turkey. And here I have 4 things that I want to mention really quickly. One of them is the ships. So there are refugee transports passing through Turkey, and Turkey, a neutral country in the war, doesn't allow any refugee ships to disembark in Istanbul or transit through land. And the famous example is the ship Struma, which has 768 people on it, and it stays off the coast of Istanbul for more than 70 days, and it's in really bad shape, but no one is allowed to disembark except one pregnant woman. And at the end of the episode, the ship is pulled back out to the Black Sea, where it is probably sinked by a Soviet submarine, and every single person on it drowns and dies, except one person who washes ashore by a miracle. Then there's the issue of the professors. Something that Turkish people like to talk about now is that Turkey accepted Jewish refugees in World War II, which, sure, there were like maybe possibly up to 200, mostly German Jewish refugees accepted, all of whom became professors because they were all professors in Nazi Germany who were fired from their jobs in major Turkish universities, and they established departments from sociology in Istanbul University to orthodontics in Istanbul University to chamber music in Ankara University. But the major point is that these people were the exception and not the rule. Another part of this story is the Turkish citizens who were Sephardic Jews who had recently moved to Europe. There were thousands upon thousands who were present mostly in France, but also in Austria and Belgium at the time. And Corey Goodstadt has done path-breaking work on this topic. Here we see the picture of the Cavallero family who were from Izmir, who were in France at the time, and they were murdered at Auschwitz. And basically the story of this family and many families like it is that they were Turkish citizens. The Turkish government decided not to try to extract them from these situations. If anything, they tried to revoke the citizenships of these families who had moved to Europe just so that they would not have to deal with them. And the last thing I want to mention about this part is the rumors of the oven. So in the 1940s, in Balat, there came to be a rumor that they were setting up an oven, a crematorium in Istanbul, if and when Germany invades or allies with Turkey, and they would murder all of the Jews. This was not true. This was a false rumor. There was a bread factory being built in that area, which the Jews had somehow made into this rumor of a crematorium. But it just goes to show the amount of fear that this community has at the time. The fear for lives is quite real and tangible, so much so that they're willing to believe that there's a crematorium being set up right next to their home. So that's the mentality that I want to convey to you about the people who we're talking about. And the last thing I want to talk about is perhaps the most famous anti-Semitic, anti-minority thing in Turkish history, which is the wealth tax. In 1942, in November, the government decides that it will start collecting a wealth tax on all people, supposedly. And the prime minister says, with this law, we will take the market away from the dominant minority traders and give the Turkish market to the Turks. So while the constitution can say every person in Turkey is a Turk, the prime minister disagrees. The minority traders are not Turks, and they are not deserving of ownership in the Turkish market. The wealth tax is outrageously priced. So here you can see the rates. So for Muslims who are wealthy, the rate is 5% of all wealth. For Greeks, it is over 150%, and for Jews, it's almost 180% of all wealth. And for Armenians, it's the highest. It's over 230. The rules of the tax are such that it cannot be challenged. So if you're assessed a tax, you must pay it in cash within 15 days. At the end of this episode, we see that 87% of the amount collected, which amounts to almost $5 billion US in today's terms, was collected by non-Muslims. And because you cannot challenge the amount and you have to pay it in 15 days, basically we see a massive transfer of housing. We see a massive transfer of household goods. And we see numerous suicides. Letters that Eli Shaul, who wrote a memoir, receives from his friends at the time, friends who are Jewish and Greek, saying that they are in deep despair, that they're going to lose everything, that their dad is not going to make it out alive from this. And about this topic, I want to share with you the memories of my grandfather. So I'm just going to quote from his submission into Rifat Bali's book of witnesses and testimonies. It was a rainy night. 3 men came to our house to take my dad. Me and my sister started to cry. My dad hugged us and said these were his friends and that they were going away for a while, but that he would come back. Every night, my uncle would take our sofa to my grand-uncle's house, and I couldn't understand why. One morning, I woke up to an auction in our house. My crayons, my favorite wooden horse, and many other items were being sold before my eyes. So this scene, etched into my grandfather's memory so clearly from when he was 8 or 7, is of his father being taken off to the forced labor camp for people who couldn't pay off their debt. And this was in Ashkale in Erzurum, which is in eastern Turkey, and it's in the middle of winter in 1942 initially. And these thousands of non-Muslims, not a single Muslim was sent to the labor camp. It's all Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. 20 people died of the conditions there. Thousands of people were paid basically nothing for breaking stones that weren't even used in anything. And while they were being sent off into these horrible conditions, they were derided in the press. They were joked about. So in this cartoon, the Turkish overseer says, "Good job, Bohorachi," a supposedly Jewish name. You've really put the stones back together. And Bohor says, "Of course, Pasha. I was a stacker in Istanbul," which is a way of saying he took advantage of people. He was a bad businessman. So while they're in forced labor camps, the Jews are still being derided in the press and smeared in anti-Semitic ways. So I want to close this time by talking about the main themes we can draw away. Basically, we're seeing a population that is trying to assimilate, that is doing its level best to take on the language of the majority, to try to clamp down on its distinctiveness, to rebrand itself from Yehudi, which is associated with bad words like pis and korkak, coward and dirty. So immediately when you say the word Jew in Turkish, the image is dirty and coward. So they're trying to rebrand with using the word Musevi. They're trying to rebrand as Turks. They have relinquished their rights that were supposedly given to them. Their schooling is entirely taken over, and they're being forced from their homes into Istanbul. Then they're being taken advantage of. They have to sell off their children's crayons, their wooden horses, their homes, their rugs, their fridges, their radios, and then go off to serve in a labor camp. So there's not really something that's analogous to this in the period before. All of this is new for the Sephardim. The requirement to speak Turkish, the requirement to assimilate, and the desire that comes with the trauma associated with these events. These are quite new to the Sephardic experience. They hadn't happened in the Ottoman Empire. Events such as these, hounding in the press, like we've seen, are new to the experience of Turkish Jews. Unfortunately, as we'll see in the coming weeks, they don't end, but it may be safe to say that 1923 to 1946 was perhaps the worst time to be a Jew in Turkey. I'll end there for questions.
So Nesi, thank you so much for our first incredible three-part lecture series we have this evening. I just want to start opening up. I want to ask if people have any questions, please type into the chat box. We'll read them out and try to get to as many as possible. I just want to keep in mind it is a bit late where Nesi is. So we want to thank him for staying up so late and his patience with all these amazing questions and having him with us tonight. So actually, I just wanted to first open up with a question from me. Maybe you can comment a little bit how you mentioned there's the campaign for Turks to speak Turkish, right? That all minority communities were forced to, and you mentioned how the trick was to get the Hebrew versus the Ladino used as a language. Can you maybe comment on then how the press was able to still print in Ladino, from many Jewish newspapers were still printing in Ladino well into the 30s, the 40s, and even to the 50s?
Yeah, basically the elderly members of the community, even if they do speak Turkish, their reliance on Ladino is quite a lot. So the Jewish press is a place where the government can allow this to continue. This is mainly because the Jewish press is just for Jews, and it's not really the public sphere for the government. So as long as they don't have to hear it, it's not a problem for them. So the main reason for the fines is that it's in public space. When you walk down the street of Istanbul or Izmir or Ankara, the point is that every person is a Turk and they speak Turkish. If they go home and read El Jugueton in Ladino, that's not a major problem, if that makes sense.
So as in the inward communities didn't have to deal with this kind of things. These were all inward-facing materials. They weren't outward-facing.
Exactly.
So
and in the Jewish press, you can also see in this time and also in the 40s later on, when the Jewish community wants to speak to Turks, they publish in Turkish in the majority Ladino paper. Like they would put a Turkish script, the Turkish piece in the front page to say like, we're not Zionists, like something like that, like make that declaration in Turkish and then have the rest of the paper be for themselves in Ladino.
So maybe we have some great questions coming in. Maybe you can comment a little bit from a fellow Turk who was actually born in Izmir, our dear friend Rachel Amado Bodnik, asks, what was the attitude of Ataturk while all these discriminatory and in some cases violent anti-minority, anti-Jewish actions were happening during his lifetime?
That's a great question, and one that we keep coming back to when we're discussing these topics. The most famous anecdote, which where it's impossible to confirm basically, but Rafat Bali seems to think that it's false, that while the pogrom in Thrace is happening, at the time actually Ataturk is in Çanakkale in the region, giving a tour to the Shah of Iran, and a Jewish man jumps in front of his car and says, Pasham, my Pasha, they're like trying to kick us out of our homes. What can you help us? Like, what do we do? And Ataturk famously says, the people are so strong that if they wanted to kick me out, they could. So I can't do anything. We don't know if this is real, but here's what I'll say. Ataturk is part of this idea of the contract of Turkishness, and it is essentially and inherently exclusive of Jews. So whether he was involved in the specifics of any of these things is questionable, but whether he approved of them is not. He clearly approved of the replacement of Jews from these sensitive areas to Istanbul. He was clearly in favor of Turkish becoming the language of every single person in Turkey and the Turkification of this country. So that is beyond question.
Another question regarding Ataturk, knowing that he was originally from Salonika, which had a majority Jewish population up until the middle of the 20th century, or even I would say early 20th century, did this affect his attitudes towards Turkey's Jewry? Do we know anything about that?
So there are, again, anecdotes. For example, supposedly Ataturk and İnönü went to Heybeliada and Jews congratulated him as he came off from his boat, and they were all cheering, and they were also speaking Ladino amongst themselves. And he asks İnönü, who are these people? And İnönü says, these are Jews. And he says, such great Turks. So supposedly he might have had some sympathy for Jews. But politically, it doesn't seem to have mattered a whole lot.
Another question here from the chat. Was there any attempt by Jews at the time to actually leave Turkey during this period?
To
leave Turkey during this period?
I wouldn't say there's a mass migration, but there's constant population loss. So from 1923, 150,000, over 150,000. By the end of this period, by 1946, we've come down to 90,000, maybe 100,000. So a third of the population is gone. But there's also, some of that is from the east, from the Kurdistani Jews, but definitely, especially during the wealth tax episode, there's people who leave. For example, even during the face pogroms, my grandfather's brother, older brother, it becomes a stowaway from Tekirdağ to Palestine. He just leaves. And those stories also exist. So yes.
Now, another question in the chat. Did the tensions between the Arabs and Jews and then the British Mandate of Palestine during these years affect Turkish attitudes towards Jewry in the country?
That's a good question. I would say they definitely affected the Jews' opinion of themselves, and they cared a lot about what was happening in Palestine. Like the Hebron massacre is a major talking point in the Jewish press at the time, though the Turks are quite unhappy with the Arabs in this period, and they're not really over that, of the Arabs who stabbed the Ottoman Empire in the back and so on. So it's not that the Turks are automatically siding with the Arabs against Jews in any way. So that's not really a dynamic that's playing out at the time.
And as a follow-up, and now kind of switching back to media, do we have any information regarding radio shows or other forms of mass media at the time? Were there any attempts by the Jewish community then to create radio shows that were Ladino or other forms of media?
I have no idea about radio shows. I'm thinking there was only one radio channel at the time owned by the government. So that would be shocking if there was any language besides Turkish that was on it. This is at a time when even the call to prayer was changed from Arabic to Turkish. So like the desire to be Turkish in public at all times is extreme. But I would have to look more into this radio question.
And there's one particular question, I might get the name one, but Munis Teki Nalp. I'm terrible with the Turkish, sorry, I have to apologize. There's a question here that he's an important character. Maybe you can speak a bit about his role and these policies and kind of tell us who this man was.
Yeah, that's a great highlight. This is one of the things that I couldn't fit into this presentation. So Munis Tekinalp was previously named Moise Cohen, and he was a Jewish man who was from Salonika, I want to say. And he then became an ideologue of Turkish nationalism. And he advocated for the assimilation of Jews into the Turkish nation. He even changed his name to a Turkish name, and advocated that all Jews speak Turkish, and would always place Jews in contradistinction to Christians on the side of Muslims and against the Christians, and say that relations between us, our two peoples, has always been great. We just should melt into the Turkish nation and become first-rate citizens. Unfortunately, we know from his life that he didn't receive the treatment he thought he would. While he became an ideologue for Turkish nationalism, the Turkish nationalists didn't always think of him as a fellow traveler. Often they still thought of him as a Jew. So his trajectory is interesting and also somewhat tragic, I would say.
Now maybe you can comment specifically about the Muslim community in relation to the Jewish community. Were there any perhaps documented efforts by Turkish Muslim groups to protect Jewish community or other minorities and potentially even challenging the government? This was a question from the chat.
So that's a good question. Obviously, not every person in Turkey at the time was anti-Semitic, obviously. The problem is we're talking about a time when there's no such thing as opposition. So that's why it's called the one-party period. The government and the state are one, and the party and the state are one, and they tolerate no opposition. One story, for example, that I couldn't fit into this is the Menemen Affair, which happens in 1931. There's this uprising of Islamists near Izmir in a town named Menemen, and they're giving speeches against the modernization reforms of Ataturk, and lots of people clap, and they behead a soldier that's trying to put this down. And then there's a trial, and everyone who's around the protest is arrested, including one Jew. And this guy named Joseph, who just owned a shop there, is arrested along with the crowd for allegedly being an Islamist and being against the government and its reforms. And he says, I didn't clap, I'm not even Muslim, I didn't do anything wrong. And his sister writes an open letter in the press saying, like, we're proud Turks, we're Jews, we're assimilating, like, we speak Turkish at home, and trying to prove their Turkishness, and it doesn't help, and they hang him. They hang Joseph. So this is the kind of cutthroat political environment that we're dealing with. There is no opposition. The Turkish public can't even speak for itself, let alone protect the Jews or Armenians or Greeks or whatever from discrimination. So yeah, I think that I'm happy to have fit that story in.
Sorry, maybe you can comment also on how the Jewish community related with other non-Muslim minorities, the Greeks, the Christians, the Armenians, whether there's any kind of sense of solidarity between these communities, or more kind of a separate struggle.
So what the Jews want specifically is to put as much distance between themselves and those two other communities. Because those two other communities in the Turkish public eye are condemned as traitors. That in this period, that's unequivocal. I mean, the army of Greece, the country, has just invaded and been pushed back in the independence war, and the idea of Armenian uprisings in the east is quite pervasive. And of course, they're collaborated supposedly with Christian outside powers like Britain, France, and so on, which in some cases is true. So the Jews are very careful to try to say, we've always been on the side of the Turks. We're not part of that non-Muslims, Armenians, Greeks, and Jews collective. And they really try to distance themselves from that conception. And we see this up until the present, I would say.
We just have time for one or two more questions. I want to keep in mind that Nesi is kindly doing this from all the way from Istanbul, so he's quite different time zone right now. But we appreciate staying up so late for us. Another question here from Megan. How much did Sephardic Jews and other Jews in Turkey kind of collaborate and strategize on how to live under these kind of new and in some cases precarious conditions?
Great question. Basically, there's one community of Jews, and the non-Sephardic members just assimilate into those structures over time. For example, the communal leadership can involve people with the last names Ginsburg or Grunberg and so on, and it's not really an issue. People don't really highlight those things, especially because the Ashkenazi population is so much smaller. And this becomes even more clear in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when the Arabic speakers from Antep, Urfa, and Antakya start coming to Istanbul, and they also quickly fit into the existing structures. And like my grandmother's family from Van to Adana to Istanbul, they also very quickly assimilated into these structures.
Last question, kind of wrapping up. Maybe you can comment kind of on that vein regarding the Jewish community cohesion, how we see major players during this period kind of rise in the community, and also leaders and how they navigated this difficult dynamic. I mean, for example, we know that Chaim Nahum, who you mentioned, the Chacham Bashi chief rabbi, actually had a seat in both the Ottoman and the Turkish Republican parliaments, as far as I know. So how, this kind of seems very kind of, very much like a paradox between, on the one hand, these great leaders lighting to these positions of power in the political side, on the other hand, also the community is facing persecution. So how did kind of the leadership and the community as itself deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's another thing that couldn't fit here, and I'm gonna talk about it a lot next week, of the destruction of the chief rabbinate as an institution, basically. So the Lausanne is giving minority communities all these rights to govern themselves. And the state is basically trying to make sure that these minorities can't be organized, that they can't have separate political and social structures that would make them be able to better advocate for themselves. And the chief rabbinate is a major part of that, because Jews, unlike the other two, also, besides the chief rabbinate, have all these structures of lay leaders who have committees and elect a president who can speak on behalf of Jews and advocate for them. And the government is trying to make these structures go away as much as possible. And we can definitely talk more about that next time.
I'm sure we're going to get to it, inshallah, next time. First, I want to thank Nesi again for staying up so late and joining us. And I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. This program, I just want to mention, was generously sponsored by Isaac and Joyce Ben Ezra, two wonderful members of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood. If you're ever interested in sponsoring this series or any other series in the future through the Sephardic Digital Academy, please reach out to us. We depend on your support. You can email us at info@sephardicbrotherhood.com. You can also find all the other amazing courses we have through the Sephardic Digital Academy at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. I want to thank you all again for being with us tonight. Just a reminder for those who haven't been told, this Sunday is a very special event we have at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, 10:30 a.m. Pacific. It will be an international commemoration of the Jews of Rhodes and Kos. It will be a very special program, especially in light of the current coronavirus situation. We couldn't physically have it in presence, but we'll actually be taking Rhodes communities from around the world, including New York, Seattle, Miami, LA, Brussels, South Africa, Rhodes, and the Chacham Bashi himself. His Excellency Yitzhak Haleva will be speaking as well. We'd love for you to join. You can find out more information on our website and our Facebook page, and RSVP at tinyurl.com/Rhodes Memorial. And we actually got a note saying, just a reminder, that there were actually a number of Turkish righteous among the nations who helped save Jews from Rhodes and get them out of Rhodes into Turkey to help them. In any case, we hope to see you there, God willing, inshallah, to commemorate these people. Nesi, thank you so much. Nos vemos.